Your hands are bound. The rope bites into your wrists so hard you can feel your pulse throbbing against the restraints. Guards drag you through the town square as hundreds of eyes follow your every step. You're naked, vulnerable, exposed to a crowd that's gathered not to save you, but to watch you suffer. Ahead of you sits a metal chair. Hundreds of sharpened iron spikes protrude from every surface. You know what comes next. Everyone here knows. The screaming always starts the same way. This wasn't fiction. This was the iron chair, one of medieval Europe's most calculated instruments of torture. For centuries, it served a dual purpose: punishment and propaganda. It was a machine designed not just to extract confessions, but to terrorize entire populations into submission. Have you ever felt powerless in the face of injustice? Have you watched systems of control crush the innocent while crowds cheered? The iron chair represents humanity's darkest capacity, the ability to engineer suffering, to turn cruelty into spectacle, and to convince ordinary people that watching someone burn alive was not only acceptable, but necessary. Today, we're descending into the torture chambers where this device inflicted unimaginable agony. We're exploring the real victims who died on these spikes, the executioners who perfected the art of slow death, and the societies that normalized this horror. This isn't entertainment. This is documented history. The devices exist in museums, the trial records are preserved, the testimonies are real, and the lessons about human nature remain as urgent today as they were 500 years ago. If you're ready to confront one of history's darkest chapters, hit that like button now. In the winter of 1577, a woman named Katherine Dez was led to the iron chair in Nuremberg's town square. She'd been accused of witchcraft, a charge as common as it was deadly in an era consumed by religious paranoia. Her real crime? Probably being an unmarried woman who practiced herbal medicine in a society that feared female independence. As they forced her onto the seat, the spikes penetrated her back, thighs, and arms. The restraints tightened until blood seeped from beneath the iron bands. Then the executioner lit the brazier beneath the chair. This is where Catherine's ordeal truly began. This is where hours of systematic torture would either break her will or end her life. Medieval Europe between the 14th and 17th centuries was a civilization teetering on the edge of collapse. The Black Death had wiped out nearly a third of the population. War, famine, and religious upheaval left survivors traumatized and desperate for answers. Into this chaos stepped the church and the state, twin powers promising order in exchange for absolute obedience. They needed enemies to blame: heretics, witches, political dissidents. Anyone who questioned authority became a target. The Inquisition, established in the 13th century, evolved into a sophisticated bureaucracy of persecution. Torture wasn't just permitted, it was required. The church published manuals detailing approved methods for extracting confessions. The iron chair occupied a special place in this arsenal. Unlike devices that targeted specific body parts, the chair attacked everywhere simultaneously. It was comprehensive cruelty, and in the eyes of its creators, it was efficient justice. The iron chair wasn't a single standardized tool. It was a category of torture instruments that shared common features, each variation reflecting local preferences for inflicting pain. At its core sat a metal seat fitted with hundreds of iron spikes. These weren't designed to kill quickly. Each spike was sharpened enough to penetrate flesh, but short enough to avoid fatal wounds. The victim's own body weight drove the spikes into their back, buttocks, thighs, and arms. Some chairs featured spikes of varying lengths, creating a landscape of pain across every surface the body touched. The restraints were equally calculated. Iron bands encircled wrists, ankles, and sometimes the neck. These were tightened until they cut into skin, preventing any movement that might allow the victim to shift weight away from the spikes. Some designs included a metal headpiece that locked the skull in place, forcing victims to stare forward as their bodies were destroyed. But the most diabolical feature was the heat. Beneath the chair sat a brazier or fire pit. As the metal gradually warmed, suffering intensified in stages. First came discomfort from heated metal, then pain from hot spikes pressing into flesh, then the smell of burning skin. Finally, the indescribable agony of being slowly roasted alive. The heat served multiple purposes. It increased pain without physical effort from the executioner. It created dramatic visual effects as smoke rose from the victim's body. And it ensured that even survivors would likely die from infected burns within days. Executioners controlled intensity by adjusting the fire. A slow burn could last hours, giving interrogators time to demand confessions. A hot fire could cook flesh in minutes, serving as swift punishment rather than prolonged interrogation. Some chairs included additional modifications: armrests lined with smaller spikes, footrests designed to crush toes, spike-covered backrests that could be cranked forward, driving the victim deeper onto the seat. These features reflected centuries of accumulated knowledge about human pain, a dark science refined through countless experiments on living subjects. Construction required skilled craftsmen. Blacksmiths who made iron chairs were specialists, often working directly for courts or inquisitorial tribunals. They understood metallurgy, human anatomy, and the mechanics of restraint. They were engineers of suffering, and their work was considered legitimate, even honorable employment. This gets darker. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The journey to the iron chair typically began with an accusation. In the climate of paranoia that gripped medieval Europe, accusations could come from anywhere: a jealous neighbor, a business rival, a spurned lover, or even anonymous denunciations dropped into church collection boxes. Once accused, the victim was arrested and brought before authorities. In cases involving heresy or witchcraft, this meant appearing before inquisitors who operated under special legal privileges. They weren't bound by normal evidentiary standards. Rumor, reputation, even dreams could serve as evidence. Interrogation began with verbal questioning. The accused was asked to confess and name accomplices. If they refused or their answers were deemed insufficient, inquisitors would order torture. This was presented as mercy, an opportunity to save one's soul through truthful admission of sin. The victim would be taken to the torture chamber, often located in castle or courthouse basements. These rooms were designed to amplify fear. Dim lighting, damp stone walls, and the display of various instruments created an atmosphere of dread. The iron chair sat prominently, its purpose unmistakable. Before torture began, victims received a final chance to confess. This was both legal formality and psychological tactic. Seeing the chair, knowing what was coming, many people broke immediately and confessed to crimes they'd never committed. Those who maintained innocence were prepared for the ordeal. Preparation involved stripping the victim naked. This served practical purposes, preventing clothing from cushioning spikes or catching fire, but it also humiliated and dehumanized. Nakedness removed the last protection of dignity, transforming the person into a body to be processed. Guards forced the victim onto the chair. The initial seating was itself torture, as hundreds of spikes penetrated flesh. Witnesses reported hearing screams at this moment, before heating even began. The body's natural instinct to pull away made restraints essential. Iron bands were clamped around wrists and ankles, then tightened until they cut into skin. Once secured, questioning resumed. Inquisitors asked their questions calmly, methodically, as if the victim weren't impaled on dozens of spikes. Meanwhile, an assistant lit the brazier beneath the chair. The fire was carefully managed, never too hot at first. Torture was designed to build gradually, allowing maximum time for confession. Understanding what victims endured requires confronting the limits of human endurance. The torture operated on multiple levels simultaneously, each compounding the others. The first wave came from the spikes themselves, hundreds of sharpened points pressed into flesh. These weren't deep wounds. The spikes pierced only the first layers, ensuring victims wouldn't bleed out quickly but would instead suffer prolonged torment from countless small injuries. The body's instinctive response made everything worse. Muscles contracted in response to pain, but movement only drove spikes deeper or created new wounds. The restraints prevented escape, trapping victims in a position where every breath, every muscle twitch caused additional injury. As metal heated, a new dimension emerged. Warmth was gradual at first, almost imperceptible, but iron conducts heat excellently. As fire intensified, the entire structure became a radiating source of thermal torture. Spikes embedded in flesh acted as tiny brands, burning from the inside out. The progression was documented by witnesses. First, profuse sweating as the body tried to cool itself, then skin reddening and blistering where it contacted heated metal. The smell of burning flesh filled the chamber, a sickly sweet odor mixing with smoke rising from the victim's body. The screaming was constant and intense. Historical accounts describe cries so loud they echoed throughout castles or town squares. Some victims screamed themselves hoarse within minutes. Others maintained consciousness and vocal capacity for hours. Psychological torture accompanied the physical. Victims knew they were being watched. In public executions, crowds gathered. In private interrogations, inquisitors and officials observed coldly, taking notes, treating the victim's agony as merely a tool to be calibrated. The mind breaks before the body in many cases. Faced with unrelenting pain and no prospect of escape, victims would confess to anything. They named innocent people as accomplices. They admitted to impossible crimes. They said whatever they thought might make it stop. This is why torture is notoriously unreliable for obtaining truth, though authorities either didn't understand this or didn't care. The historical record preserves numerous specific cases of iron chair torture. These accounts come from trial records, executioner memoirs, witness testimonies, and occasional diaries. Each offers a window into the human cost of systematic cruelty. In 1598, in the German city of Würzburg, a woman named Anna Hansen was accused of witchcraft by 3 separate neighbors. The accusations claimed she'd cursed their crops and caused miscarriages in their livestock. Anna was a midwife, which automatically made her suspect in an era that conflated medical knowledge with supernatural power. Trial records indicate Anna denied all charges initially. She was subjected to the iron chair in what was described as a formal interrogation. The torture session lasted approximately 3 hours. Court documents note that Anna confessed after 2 hours to consorting with demons and attending Sabbaths where she'd allegedly danced with the devil. She also named 7 other women as fellow witches. These women were arrested within days. 5 of them were also tortured and confessed. All 8 were burned at the stake within a month of Anna's initial confession. Modern historians recognize this as a classic example of how torture produced false confessions that cascaded into mass persecution. Another documented case comes from Spain in 1623. Don Garcia de Mendoza, a minor nobleman, was accused of blasphemy and heretical statements questioning church authority. His true crime appears to have been a land dispute with a more powerful family who had connections to the Inquisition. Garcia was subjected to the iron chair as part of his interrogation. Unlike many victims, he refused to confess, even under extreme torture. Inquisition records note the session lasted over 4 hours and that Garcia lost consciousness multiple times. Each time, he was revived with cold water and questioning resumed. Eventually, Garcia did make a confession, but it was carefully worded to admit only minor theological errors rather than full heresy. His social status may have afforded him some protection. He wasn't executed but was sentenced to house arrest and required to pay a substantial fine. He survived the iron chair but carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of his life. The city of Nuremberg maintained particularly detailed records of its torture proceedings. Franz Schmidt, the city's executioner from 1573 to 1617, kept a diary that included descriptions of 361 executions and numerous torture sessions. His entries are remarkably matter-of-fact, describing the iron chair as simply another tool in his professional repertoire. Katherine Dez, whose story opened this exploration, died on the iron chair after confessing to crimes she almost certainly didn't commit. Anna Hansen and 7 other women were burned alive based on confessions extracted through torture. Don Garcia de Mendoza survived but was permanently scarred. These weren't isolated incidents, they were part of systematic practice that continued for centuries. The victims of the iron chair were mothers and fathers, daughters and sons. They were people with hopes and fears, with relationships and daily routines. They were human beings who experienced unimaginable pain, who screamed until their voices gave out, who died in ways designed to maximize their suffering. These weren't just names in history books, they were real people. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on how fear was used to control entire populations. To operate the iron chair required not just physical strength but specific knowledge and a particular mindset. The executioners who managed these torture sessions were professionals, often hereditary specialists who passed their knowledge from father to son. They occupied a strange social position, necessary for maintaining order yet deeply stigmatized by their work. Executioners were trained in what we might today call applied anatomy. They needed to understand how much pain the human body could endure without dying, how to recognize signs of impending death, and how to maximize suffering while preserving consciousness. This knowledge was passed down through apprenticeship, with experienced executioners teaching novices the craft of controlled cruelty. Franz Schmidt, whose diary provides invaluable historical insight, described his work with clinical detachment. He viewed torture as a necessary function of justice, no different from other judicial procedures. His entries record the methods used, the duration of sessions, and whether confessions were obtained, all in the same neutral tone one might use to describe carpentry or farming. The social isolation of executioners was profound. They were required to live outside town walls, couldn't attend regular church services, and were forbidden from socializing with most citizens. Their children couldn't attend regular schools. This ostracism was based on the belief that touching death and causing suffering made executioners ritually unclean, contaminated by their profession. Yet society desperately needed these men. Without executioners, the apparatus of justice and control would collapse. So, communities maintained a hypocritical relationship with these specialists, depending on them, while simultaneously shunning them. Executioners were well paid for their work, receiving fees for each torture session and execution, often accumulating substantial wealth despite their pariah status. Some developed a grim pride in their expertise. They saw themselves as skilled craftsmen performing difficult but essential work. They took care of their tools, maintaining the iron chair and other devices in good working order. The psychological toll of this work must have been immense, though historical records rarely address it directly. How does a person maintain sanity while regularly inflicting extreme suffering? Some executioners apparently turned to alcohol. Others developed elaborate justifications, framing their work as a form of religious service that purified the community by removing evil. Interestingly, some executioners also served as healers. Because they possessed unique anatomical knowledge from their work with torture and execution, they were sometimes consulted for setting bones or treating injuries. This dual role as both destroyer and healer created a strange paradox, further complicating their position in society. When the iron chair was used in public settings, it transformed torture into theater. Executions and torture sessions were major social events that drew crowds from across the region. Town squares would fill with spectators from nobility viewing, from special platforms to commoners jostling for position. This was entertainment, education, and intimidation rolled into one display. The staging was carefully orchestrated. Announcements would be made days in advance detailing the crimes of the accused and the punishment to be administered. On the day of torture, the victim would be paraded through streets, sometimes on a cart with town criers announcing their sins. This procession served to maximize humiliation and build anticipation. The crowd's reaction varied. Some spectators came primarily for entertainment, treating the event like any other public performance. Vendors would sell food and drink. Children would be hoisted onto shoulders for a better view. The atmosphere could be almost festive, a disturbing reminder of how normalized violence had become. Others attended out of religious obligation or social pressure. Witnessing punishment was considered a civic duty, a way of demonstrating solidarity with community values and authority structures. Absence from major executions could itself draw suspicion. The spectacle served multiple propaganda purposes. It demonstrated the power and reach of authority, showing that no one was beyond punishment. It reinforced religious and moral boundaries, making clear what behaviors wouldn't be tolerated. And it provided communal catharsis, allowing the crowd to project their fears and frustrations onto a designated scapegoat. The visual and auditory elements of iron chair torture made it particularly effective as spectacle. The smoke rising from the victim's body, the screams echoing across the square, the smell of burning flesh, these sensory experiences created powerful memories that spectators would carry with them. The message was clear: this could happen to you. The gradual abandonment of judicial torture, including the iron chair, wasn't a sudden humanitarian awakening. It was a complex process driven by changing legal philosophies, political shifts, and evolving social attitudes. The Enlightenment of the 18th century brought new philosophical frameworks that challenged traditional justifications for torture. Thinkers like Cesare Beccaria argued that torture was both morally wrong and practically ineffective. His 1764 treatise on crimes and punishments systematically demolished the legal and rational arguments for torture, influencing reform movements across Europe. Legal reforms followed philosophical critique. Prussia abolished torture in 1754, followed by Saxony in 1770, Austria in 1776, and France in 1788. These changes were often driven by monarchs influenced by Enlightenment ideals who saw modern rational governance as incompatible with medieval torture practices. The end of the witch trials in the late 17th and early 18th centuries removed one major justification for torture. As educated elites increasingly rejected belief in witchcraft as superstition, the interrogation methods used to obtain confessions from supposed witches lost their legitimacy. But here's what the iron chair teaches us that matters most today. The normalization of cruelty is never an aberration. It's a choice societies make when fear overrides humanity. The victims of the iron chair were first dehumanized through accusation and trial. They were labeled as enemies of God, threats to the community, or agents of supernatural evil. Once stripped of their humanity through rhetoric and ritual, Their suffering could be observed without empathy. This dynamic isn't confined to medieval Europe. Throughout history and into the present day, societies have found ways to classify certain humans as less than human, thereby justifying their mistreatment. The specific technologies of cruelty change, but the underlying psychological and social mechanisms remain remarkably consistent. The Iron Chair also teaches us about the bureaucratization of evil. The torture chambers operated within legal frameworks. There were rules about who could be tortured, for how long, and under what circumstances. Executioners were licensed professionals. Confessions were documented by scribes. The entire apparatus had the veneer of legitimacy and process. This bureaucratic structure allowed individuals to participate in extreme cruelty while psychologically distancing themselves from responsibility. The inquisitor could claim he was merely following church law. The executioner was just doing his job. The scribe was only keeping records. The Iron Chair exists now primarily in museums, a relic of a brutal past that most modern people would prefer to forget. Yet there's value in remembering, in forcing ourselves to confront the uncomfortable truth that these devices were real, were used on real people, and were considered legitimate by societies not so different from our own. The Iron Chair is gone from our justice systems, but the impulses that created it remain in human nature. The desire for absolute security, the fear of the other, the belief that extreme measures are sometimes necessary. Our challenge is to acknowledge these impulses while refusing to let them guide our actions or shape our institutions. History's darkest moments teach us the most important lessons. If this opened your eyes, share this video, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications, because understanding the past is how we protect the future.